Hi, I'm Marcin Kuśmierczyk. Welcome to Eastern Insights. Why does Eastern Europe's perspective on global affairs matter? Because here, history and geopolitics collide in ways that shape our world. Yet these voices often go unheard. This podcast bridges this gap. Each episode translates in-depth analysis from my Polish YouTube channel, Polityka Zagraniczna, which means international politics. For the last few years, this platform has dissected foreign policy, security, and the forces shaping Eastern Europe. Using AI tools like 11 Labs, we adapt these nuanced insights into English, preserving their depth while making them accessible to all. Whether we're unpacking Russia's latest moves, EU debates, or security challenges in Central Europe, our mission is simple: to foster informed dialogue by sharing Eastern Europe's untold stories. If you're curious about the world beyond headlines, subscribe now. Join me as we decode the complexities of global affairs, one Eastern European insight at a time.
Welcome back to the podcast. Today we're diving deep into a fascinating and critical shift in global politics: the evolving stance of the United States toward the war in Ukraine. For months, it seemed like the US was trying to coax Russia into peace with a carrot approach. But now it looks like the stick is finally coming out. Donald Trump's perspective on the war? It's clearly changing. And while he's delayed the implementation of his threatened sanctions once again, a new mechanism for financing and arming Ukraine, introduced jointly with the NATO Secretary General, might just open a whole new chapter in this conflict. So the big questions are, why didn't the Russians seize that window of opportunity when the Americans were, let's say, proud of them? Has Vladimir Putin become a prisoner of the very war he started? And how do the Americans plan to involve Europe in this unfolding situation? The shift in the US administration's position regarding the war isn't a huge surprise. I actually discussed this possibility in a previous episode from early June, noting that things were heading in this direction. After months of diplomatic efforts, including visits from Trump's special envoy to Moscow and high-profile talks held in places like Turkey and Saudi Arabia, it became increasingly clear that Russia was, frankly, toying with the peace talks initiated by the Americans. Rhetorically, the Russians maintained the appearance of wanting peace, but in practice, they did everything in their power to prove they had no intention of actually achieving it. As Trump himself put it, Trump spoke beautifully and then bombarded people at night. But before we dig into this new American policy toward Russia, it's worth asking a truly important question. Why did Russia react this way? Why did the Russians reject what many consider to be a substantial American offer that's been on the table for months? The Trump administration worked hard to create a path for Russia to exit the war in a way that would allow the Kremlin to save face. The game, in essence, was about de jure recognition of Russia's current territorial gains, coupled with the lifting of economic sanctions and an end to political isolation. Russia stood to gain land, status, and access to global markets. And yet, Vladimir Putin chose to conspicuously reject such an offer. Think about this. One of the major reasons for the collapse of the Soviet Union was its intervention in Afghanistan. The economic and social costs were immense, significantly impacting the country's stability. In Afghanistan, the Soviets lost between 12,000 and 20,000 soldiers, with over 50,000 wounded. Now, according to an analysis from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Russia's losses in Ukraine this year alone are projected to exceed 1 million soldiers. Ukrainian estimates suggest they've already surpassed that number. It's truly astonishing how much this war has preceded us. We often don't fully appreciate the sheer scale of the conflict happening right on Europe's doorstep. Despite the opposing rhetoric of a special operation, Russia today is a country deeply involved in a full-blown war. Its political system doesn't just function on military grounds. It's almost dependent on them. Whole. And yet, despite the country's transition to a war footing, despite such colossal losses, Russia hasn't even been able to fulfill its minimum war goals, the very goals that served as the pretext for its beginning. After more than 3 years of war and over 1 million lost soldiers, Russia still hasn't even fully occupied the areas it has formally annexed. In the public sphere, particularly in the Polish public sphere, it's often said that Russia, perhaps more slowly than expected, is definitely winning the war in Ukraine. The argument is that Russia has more resources, more people, and therefore, in the end, it will colloquially speaking annihilate the Ukrainians. But let's pause for a moment. If the war stopped today, could it truly be considered a Russian victory, despite their territorial gains? Is this war really about square kilometers? Did Russia manage to liquidate Ukrainian statehood or Ukrainian sovereignty? Did it manage to change the regime in Ukraine, to change the power dynamic in that country? Has Ukraine become a puppet state today? Did Russia manage to recreate its sphere of influence in Central and Eastern Europe? Did this war strengthen Russia's position in global politics, or perhaps even weaken it? Did the Russian army prove to be the second strongest army in the world? Is this a war that will restore the Russian Empire? Can Vladimir Putin, with the help of this war, join figures like Catherine the Great and Peter the Great in the pantheon of Russian leaders? If you establish state policy on the track of rebuilding an empire, on the restitution of that empire, on the basis of disciplining rebellious colonies, then you simply cannot stop at this point and declare it a success. Quite the opposite, in fact. Putin stated in June of this year, repeating it again and again, that Russians and Ukrainians are one nation, in the sense that the whole of Ukraine is ours. This follows the rhetoric that Ukrainians aren't a nation at all, but merely some strange, specific part of Russian national identity. If this is the ideology, if this is the source of state policy, if this is the country spreading imperialist thought, and on the other hand, we have a reality where the Russians haven't even gained full control of the annexed parts of Donbass, then we have a huge disparity here.
This is why there's a wider strategic plan at play. The expansion of NATO to include Sweden and Finland, the loss of markets for their resources, or perhaps a freedom with a muzzle, but still with military capabilities aimed at deterring Russia in the future. And I absolutely do not mean to suggest that Russia is somehow easily dismissed, as if to say it's a country full of scoundrels riddled with corruption, that it will fall apart at any moment, or that Russia means nothing at all. Russia remains dangerous precisely because it sets such ambitious goals for itself and strives to realize them. It's not worth underestimating it. But just taking into account the Russian way of looking at Ukraine, Russia simply cannot accept peace right now. If we consider long-term Russian imperialism, if we consider how the Russians look at Ukraine with a sense of superiority, if we consider that the current regime is fighting for its place in the broad history of this country, and if we consider the significance of this war for the stability of the current political system, then Russia currently cannot give up, not with this scale of involvement. Because what do we have? On one hand, over 1 million lost soldiers, killed and wounded. We have a still existing Ukraine, whose statehood has not been destroyed. Ukraine is getting closer to the West, it's increasingly anti-Russian, and it has a rapidly accelerating modern drone industry. And on the other hand, we have, well, square kilometers. It's impossible to give up. If you think about Ukraine in terms of a rebellious province, with this scale of military involvement. From the Russian point of view, peace is simply not acceptable. But Russia's problem is that this point of view is based on the assumption that Russia is, by nature, an empire capable of regional domination. And a policy carried out in accordance with this assumption, when the assumption itself cannot be implemented, leads Russia into a trap. Because if Russia were to give up, it would have to admit that it is not a country capable of completely dominating our region, not even over Ukraine. And a Russia that is constantly involved in the war, on the other hand, burns through its resources and becomes bogged down in eastern Ukraine, which was supposed to be just the beginning of a much wider game. In this sense, thoughtful Putin becomes a prisoner of the war he started. At the same time, coming to the conclusion that the current state of affairs isn't satisfying Russian appetites, that Russia simply cannot agree to such a peace, leads to conflicts of interest with the United States. While I don't know how much America initially wanted to involve Russia in its global political agenda today, or how much it wanted to approach Russia as an important player in the power game over spheres of influence, America absolutely cannot agree to a Russian victory in this war. It cannot agree to Russian regional domination. Donald Trump cannot allow peace on Russia's terms because it would define his presidency and lead to a cascade of powerful strategic consequences for the United States. America simply cannot afford it. And that's why we return to the same conclusion. Russia cannot be convinced to make peace today. It must be forced into peace. Russia must be shown, through strength, that its strategic goals are, and will remain, unattainable. It's clear that coming to this conclusion was painful and frustrating for the American administration. Everything was supposed to look different. But even if you view the world through the prism of a Mozart game, a power struggle that blocks spheres of influence. Russian imperialism is currently, at least for now, in direct disagreement with American policy, with the American strategic vision, and with American foreign policy, and hence, the new arms supply to Ukraine. Now, let's break down this new American approach into two separate issues: weapons and sanctions. According to the President of the United States, the new scheme for supplying arms to Ukraine is designed to make Europeans pay for American equipment. Initially, we're talking about purchases worth $10 billion. In a rather amusing reversal of roles, this time it's Europe, through figures like Kai Kallas, appealing to Americans to share the burden. This is the famous burden sharing that Americans have historically used to encourage Europeans to increase their defense investments. In any case, a few points are worth considering here. First, Trump truly has no other option today. If he wants to supply weapons to Ukraine, he has to do it using a mechanism that appears to be a great business deal that doesn't burden the United States. This is due to the fact that his relationship with the MAGA movement's electoral base and its influential opinion makers can already be considered quite tense. I'm referring back to my earlier material about American involvement in the Israel-Iran conflict. Trump, whose electoral platform was built on ending wars, even if he continues his policy of supporting Ukraine, has to do so using less direct mechanisms, at least at this stage. Trump has done everything in his power to ensure everyone hears 500,000 times that it will be Europe, not America, paying for this equipment. Secondly, such a scheme fits perfectly into Trump's broader policy toward Europe. This is a recurring theme that hardly needs further elaboration. Europe is expected to start paying for its own security. Donald Trump cannot allow peace on Russia's terms because it would define his presidency and lead to a cascade of powerful strategic consequences for the United States. America simply cannot afford it. And that's why we return to the same conclusion. Russia cannot be convinced to make peace today. It must be forced into peace. Russia must be shown, through strength, that its strategic goals are, and will remain, unattainable. It's clear that coming to this conclusion was painful and frustrating for the American administration. Everything was supposed to look different. But even if you view the world through the prism of a Mozart game, a power struggle that blocks spheres of influence, Russian imperialism is currently, at least for now, in direct disagreement with American policy, with the American strategic vision, and with American foreign policy, and hence, the new arms supply to Ukraine. Now, let's break down this new American approach into two separate issues: weapons and sanctions. According to the President of the United States, the new scheme for supplying arms to Ukraine is designed to make Europeans pay for American equipment. Initially, we're talking about purchases worth $10 billion. In a rather amusing reversal of roles, this time it's Europe, through figures like Kai Kallas, appealing to Americans to share the burden. This is the famous burden sharing that Americans have historically used to encourage Europeans to increase their defense investments. In any case, a few points are worth considering here. First, Trump truly has no other option today. If he wants to supply weapons to Ukraine, he has to do it using a mechanism that appears to be a great business deal that doesn't burden the United States. This is due to the fact that his relationship with the MAGA movement's electoral base and its influential opinion makers can already be considered quite tense. I'm referring back to my earlier material about American involvement in the Israel-Iran conflict. Trump, whose electoral platform was built on ending wars, even if he continues his policy of supporting Ukraine, has to do so using less direct mechanisms, at least at this stage. Trump has done everything in his power to ensure everyone hears 500,000 times that it will be Europe, not America, paying for this equipment. Secondly, such a scheme fits perfectly into Trump's broader policy toward Europe. This is a recurring theme that hardly needs further elaboration. Europe is expected to start paying for its own security. Third, the fact that Europe hasn't rejected such a plan demonstrates the profound dependence on American equipment. Today, it is simply irreplaceable. If Ukraine is to defend itself, especially if it's to be less susceptible to air attacks, patriots are desperately needed. Fourth, it's obvious that in the long term, such a mechanism is unfavorable for Europe. As the stakes of the global game become clearer, where production is located, who gets jobs, where the economic and social benefits remain, the idea that Europe should simply funnel orders into the American industry will not garner long-term support from European societies. Nevertheless, the issue of sanctions remains problematic. It's worth breaking it down into 2 points. First, when it comes to sanctions aimed at cutting Russians off from the American market, this matter is actually of no great importance. Trade on the Russian-American line isn't significant enough to act as a lever in political relations. We're talking about imports at the level of $3 billion, if I remember correctly. Russia primarily exports energy resources, which are also exported from the United States. Americans don't need Russian gas or Russian oil. For Russia, America is not an important trading market. So, the fact that Americans won't buy Russian products simply doesn't matter. That's why the Americans, when they want to threaten Russia, use what are called secondary sanctions. These are sanctions imposed on those who still buy Russian raw materials, who still trade with the Russian Federation. This is the mechanism I mentioned in another material, which has its source in the American Senate. In short, the Americans want to impose very high fines, or perhaps a very low rate, because it will change another 150,000 times, but essentially, very high fines on those who, for example, buy Russian oil or generally trade with the Russian Federation. Theoretically, it sounds like a serious threat, but it's a bit like saying, "I'll cut my hand off while trimming your nails." Thoughtful, are the Americans really capable of cutting off other nations from their market due to trade with the Russian Federation? Cutting off India? Cutting off Europe? Cutting off China? Cutting off all other participants in international trade who still use Russian raw materials, including the European Union, let's not forget? This mechanism is a threat, yes, but as serious as it sounds, a lot of problems are associated with actually implementing this type of mechanism in real life. How would it work in practice? How would all these shutdowns function? How would it manage international trade? That's why this threat is still, shall we say, 50 days away, and it doesn't seem to me that it's such a serious or real threat that the Russians will suddenly beg the Americans for peace. They will most likely check what the Americans have in store once those 50 days are up. Of course, this doesn't mean that economically or sanction-wise the Americans are defenseless. They can certainly damage Russia very much. But is this necessarily the mechanism? Thoughtful. I have my doubts about that. Can we even talk about any breakthrough here? Because there are no new sanctions being imposed on Russia. And when it comes to weapons, the Americans have simply allowed Europeans to buy American equipment that will then be delivered to Ukraine. So, has there really been a breakthrough? Nevertheless, it seems to me that the change in Trump's perspective and the overall approach of the United States to the war is clear. And this may be an important turning point. America clearly sought to end this war quickly, primarily at Ukraine's expense. America clearly wanted different relations with the Russian Federation and different relations with Europe. But these systemic and strategic conditions proved to be unbearable. We're seeing how, step by step, even a different perspective on the world, a different logic for looking at international relations, actually leads American policy to this current point of exit. What I mean is, even when looking at the world through the prism of great empires dividing spheres of influence, Russian imperialism, at the present time, is still in fundamental disagreement with American politics, with the American political class, and with the American vision of building foreign policy. When it comes to Europe, this issue perfectly demonstrates how very dependent Europe still is on the United States. We're observing what I can only describe as a festival of Donald Trump licking himself, in which even NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte participates. It's evident that American equipment is desperately needed, and you can see the far-reaching concessions Europe is willing to make in negotiations with America, as long as the stream of this equipment continues to flow to Ukraine. But at the same time, in the long term, the European political class will inevitably confront a fairly obvious thought. If Europe is to finance the war, if Europe is to invest its own money, its own funds, wouldn't it be better to build its own industrial base? Because these are the times we live in, where it's also important, or perhaps mainly, a fight about where the production will be located, who will make money on the equipment produced, and where the jobs and social and economic benefits from multi-billion-dollar investments will reside. And sooner or later, if it's European money, the thought will emerge, it should also be a European employee, working on European equipment. But of course, such a thing as a singular European employee and European equipment doesn't quite exist. Cuckles. Thank you for tuning in. We'll be back soon with more analysis.